laptop people? Okay, we're going to do a bit more Minsky stuff today. So, I know a lot of people's stuff crashed as we were doing it, and you lost the work. Some bug came up because it's only had about $250,000 American dollars poured into building it, which has given us about maybe 2,500, 3,000 hours of programming time, which is nothing compared to the software you're used to working with most of the time. I imagine Word and stuff like that had millions, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of programming hours. And if there are still bugs in Word and Excel which piss me off every day when they damn well cause my computer to crash or lock up or something like that. So Minsky's got the same flaws. And that's what I did. When you're working with it, I save multiple times. So I'll save, we're working on a file, I might be calling it, say, for example, Loanable Funds 01. And then I'll have 02 and 03 and 04 and 05. And at least if anything goes wrong with 06, I can go back to 05. So that's what I recommend doing for a while if you start doing any of this work now. And also, I'm going to take a risk this morning, and that is that there's a new beta version of the program which covers a few issues you had in the one you were using last or 2 weeks ago, but it introduced its own issue on my computer back at home, a weird hassle with the wires that connect variables together, the assignment cable. So I'm just going to try nonetheless reinstalling that. So if you go to SourceForge and Minsky, you got that page open? As he says, the website is called SourceForge.net, and if you just type SourceForge and then space Minsky in your browser, the browser will most likely find the web page. So bring that up. Okay, once you've done that, if you see when you're on the home page for it, let's sort of bring that back up again. That always links here to the most recent Windows version of the program that's got an install routine to it. So that version there is about 4 months old, I think. What Russell does is work on regular updates, and they go and the browser files line there. If you click on that, you then see this thing, beta builds, and then source code, etc., etc. So what I want you to do is go to the beta build, and if you've got a Mac here, any Mac users? Okay, there's a Mac version there as well. So there's a Mac or a PC. Obviously Mac and Win, you can tell which one is which. So click on the win.msi, which will go to this download page.
Is that the one you posted on the studies piece?
No, this is the later one again. I mean, I posted an earlier version which didn't have the bug that hit my computer, and Russell said he couldn't reproduce it this morning. He programs on a Linux machine, and he uses a virtual Windows box running on that, which he couldn't reproduce the problem I found. So I'm going to stick my neck out and see if I generate it here. If I don't, then it's something peculiar about my other computer. If I do, then it's something to do with Windows 10 in a real machine rather than a virtual machine. The way things are going, I'm this close to moving across to Linux completely myself, I might add. I only use Windows because it runs MathCAD, which is a program which has been trashed by the company that currently owns it. I'm getting to the stage where I think I'm going to make a move and forget about that and go across to something with a cleaner operating system. Okay, actually once that's downloaded, that MSI file, you click on it. MSI is a Microsoft install file. It must still be downloading a bit on my machine. Okay, what's going on here? Here we go. Okay, now you'll get this window error coming up. You know Microsoft, the nanny state, or the nanny corporation? If you just click on more info, it then gives you an option of run anyway. Okay? So go through and do that, click on run anyway, and then you get the install script. Have to accept the terms as usual, which are that's a straight open source license, of course. Then go through and install. Takes about a minute or so. How's it going? Are you downloading okay? Good. Okay, then finish, and you've got the latest version. Now what it installs is not Minsky, it installs Minsky beta. And the reason for that is because when you're using the beta program, it will develop bugs that don't exist in the current version. Software development is a huge 90% bug chasing, the more complicated you get with the software. So this means I can run the current development version and the most recent beta at the same time. So if anything goes wrong with the beta, I can go back to the development one. So anything you can open with Minsky, you can open with the beta and vice versa. You just have to run the program itself. You can't rely upon File Manager because that'll default to the latest one you've chosen. So click on Minsky beta, and that'll bring it up because it looks exactly the same. Well, the only way you're going to know a difference, if you go to File, About, it tells you the versioning number here. And that's the coding that Russell uses at 1 because we still regard ourselves as actually probably both approaching version 1 rather than being at version 1. 48 the development cycle, and D006 is the actual iteration within the numbers of beta development cycles has been through producing this particular beta. That's it. So we've got it running there. Let's go back and start the lecture, and then I'll head over and we'll use Minsky in anger on this whole issue of money. Now, so last week what I went through was Graziani's, what I see as quite brilliant insights but lousy mathematics. And that's just one of the things which tends to affect non-orthodox economics, because if they know mathematics and people who don't understand it, i.e. neoclassical economists, they do what I call mythematics, not mathematics. So if you want to get further into the mathematics of what I'm doing, highly recommend doing a course with an actual maths department rather than putting up with what they teach you on quantitative methods in economics. Now, once you got rid of the bad maths, you got a very coherent vision. So getting rid of the mistakes that were made, which were basically stock flow identification errors, you end up with a very coherent model of money dynamics and so on. And it's where I developed the whole idea of double entry bookkeeping. I didn't realise the importance of it until while I was developing Minsky. You'll actually see if you actually bring up a godly table, you have a blank canvas, just click on the icon there, drag it somewhere and click, and then you've got a table. Right click and choose open godly table. Notice if it says double entry. Reason being, the first few models I developed using this table approach to developing consistent records of financial flows wasn't double entry. That's going to go on the next. When I get enough finance to go through and do it, we're going to come up with a completely revised godly table, which automatically divides up into assets, liabilities, and equity. Every time you load them, it's always double entry. I'm just going to get rid of that legacy there, but that's why it's there. And that's why I've got to click on this no asset class thing here, because initially we didn't identify accounts as being any type of, whether we didn't identify a bank account, which is what Minsky's godly tables model, as being an asset or an equity or a liability. Now we always do. So you've got to go through this, for a while. At some point that will all change, and when you load a later version of the program, it'll come up with a table that has assets, liabilities and equity all set up, ready to roll. And you expand one or the other. A bit of history there. Anyway, so I would never have developed that without two influences. One was both meeting Graziani and reading his 1989 paper, which is one of the recommended readings that you've got for the course. And the other is meeting Wing Godley and seeing how Wing used double entry. And between those two influences, that's where I came up with the idea of tables for that. Okay, a bit long-winded there. Now, last week I went through and I regarded one of the lunatic ideas, the money multiplying model of money creation, which actually violates double entry bookkeeping. I'm going to probably do a post at some stage on my Forbes where I actually go through and just show just what nonsense it is if you actually try to follow that, iterative. The total imbalance you'll get in assets and liabilities, and the total instability of the system. So just because they're getting so sick of people still believing it. But the other lunatic idea is the neoclassical vision of loanable funds. And I'm emphasising neoclassical there because I know there are various debates in post-Keynesian economics about the actual nature of loanable funds. I'm simply going with the absolutely core difference between loanable funds and endogenous money, and that is that the loanable funds model treats banks as simply intermediaries. They arrange loans between other people. They don't originate. And that leads on to explaining the role of credit in aggregate demand and income. I won't have we have a lot more time for talking today because I'm doing a presentation for the Bank of England tomorrow, and that sort of wiped out my time as well as this cold, so I haven't got as much material done, but I think it's good contextual stuff to go into the important, the way I'm going to model Minsky in the future weeks. Okay, so this is what I see as a lunatic idea. Well, let's go through what they argue. The mainstream sees banks as being institutions that arrange loans between other agents, not as institutions that originate in the first instance. And this was a relatively recent, stupid direction in the history of economic thought. If you go back prior to the 1940s, you find it was quite common for people to accept that banks create money by lending. You find it in Vixel, you find it in Pigou, you find it in Keynes, you find it in Fisher. It's not exactly controversial. Then after this, partly because I think maybe as they started to realise what the ramifications were of actually modelling that, it doesn't work out so well for the neoclassical vision of equilibrium. You came up with the argument they're just intermediaries, very much an American tradition coming out of James Tobin initially. But now you get people like Bernanke and Krugman and co have been raised in this tradition, and it really is a case of wearing a set of blinkers. They can't see any other way, and I want to take the blinkers off today. This is Ben Bernanke's Essays on the Great Depression, which I reckon is one of the great comedy books of the 20th century, because the guy got the job as governor of the Federal Reserve on the basis that he was the expert on the Great Depression. Now, if you're the expert on the Great Depression in a genuine sense, you read every major contribution about it and you consider it critically. Here he is considering, not exactly critically, Irving Fisher's argument about debt deflation. He simply says that Fisher's idea was less influential because of the counter-argument that debt deflation represents no more than a redistribution from one group debtors to another creditors. Now, can you see an obvious fallacy even at that point in that statement? It's an obvious fallacy there. Did debtors pay their debts back during a debt deflation, or did they go bankrupt? Okay? He's ignoring bankruptcy in that statement. But that alone I find stunning. But you can get away with that stuff in the neoclassical tradition. Anything I say which is remotely critical gets pulled apart with tweezers, very badly designed tweezers, but nonetheless. They can make a guffling like this and off they go. Okay. Now he says this argument, I'm going to come down and actually show why this is correct and wrong simultaneously. Okay, if you work with loanable funds, it's correct. He says absolutely implausibly large differences in marginal spending propensities amongst groups. It was suggested pure distribution should have no significant macroeconomic effects. That's the proposition he makes. So that was it. I mean, what he wanted to do is go and do a sort of new Keynesian interpretation of what Fisher was talking about. It became something where the quantity of credit was not an issue, the price of credit, or signalling and stuff like that in a very neoclassical way. This is my other mate Krugman, and this is in his book End This Depression Now! So when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. So it's saying there's no link between the level of debt and the amount of money in the economy. It's rather a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. Now again, I just find this. We need Derrida in the room to deconstruct the language here. Who are the good guys in that statement? Who are the good people? The patient people. Who are the bad people? Impatient. But economics is a value-free science, isn't it? That's why we use words like patient and impatient, perfect and imperfect, to describe various situations and load your brains up with the bias to begin with. What about if I said savers and entrepreneurs? Who are the good and who are the bad? You know? Okay. It's really, in a way, the pejorative language turns up in every element of their thinking. Okay. Now, the Bank of England knows a lot better than that, and it's one of the reasons I'm delighted to be over in London these days, so I regularly get to meet with them. And I know the authors of this paper, and I didn't know they were coming out with a paper. I think it was for post-Keynesian, non-orthodox people interested in endogenous money. This was a godsend. We didn't have any real warning. Maybe somebody in England had some warning. I didn't. I saw the paper come out, and I was just blown away because it makes a categorical, emphatic statement, and they've backed it up with a video and a website about it. So they're really trying to communicate. So, hats off to the Bank of England on this front. That whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. I'm going to elaborate on that and go further than that, so the money doesn't stay in the borrower's account for all that long, but nonetheless that's the initial position. And, of course, the mainstream can't see why this matters. This is Krugman, when the paper came out, colour me puzzled. You said it's people say it offers some radical new way. I just can't see it, and somehow outside the usual rules of economics. Don't let monetary realism slide into monetary mysticism. Well, the mystics are the neoclassicals, and I want to show why today. Just dismissing the importance of that paper. So, again, the willingness to weave and dodge rather than take an honest argument on is what really irritates me about this model. But let's take a look at the whole thing from the point of view of double entry bookkeeping, which is why I've got Minsky loaded there. Now, if you see lending as a pure distribution, then you're looking at it from the point of view from assets and liabilities and equity now, and if we're taking the accounting view, what's actually going on? Well, if you have a lending from one non-bank to another non-bank, and there's a transfer from the saver's account to the investor's account. I'm using rather less pejorative words now, saver and investor rather than patient and impatient. Then there's a paying of interest back, and then there's a repayment. All you're doing is you're shuffling entries on the liability side of the bank sheet, and there's nothing happening on the asset side. Now, if you see when banks are originators, and what's actually happening, there's the from and to are a bit misleading, of course. I'm going to change that. But you've got assets and liabilities rise when the loan is made, and assets and liabilities fall when the loan is repaid. Okay? So you've got an instant creation of money. There's plenty of action in that case on the asset side. Now, they're saying there's no difference between the two. So what I want to do is set up a situation where one applies and then change the other and see if there's any difference. Okay? And empirically about it. So with Minsky, I'm going to have two firm sectors. When you look at that, the Krugman, those papers by Krugman came out at a time he published a paper with a DSGE model with Eggertson, who clearly Eggertson was the one who did the DSGE model. And that's, if you go to the Quarterly Journal of Economics where the paper is stored, you'll find the supplementary materials include a very hastily written appendix, lots of typing errors and stuff like that still in the appendix. But down the end of it, there's a model where he actually has what he calls a bank. And what he calls a bank is a loan which lasts for one period. So again, when they model banks, they have a totally bastardised picture of what a bank actually is. It's simply a one-period loan that's then paid back at the end of the period, in some ways reproducing Graziani's errors on that front. But that is what they talk about: a consumer agent borrowing from, but lending to an investor agent using a bond. The bond, by the way, is not in money. The bond is in the commodity. Okay. So again, it's a world where it's still a commodity model. They call it banking. So in this thing, the consumption in their sector is the saver and the investor is the borrower. So I'm going to set that up and using a basic godly table for a bank. So that's what I want you to build. So let's just go across to Minsky and I'll go through it step by step with you. So I've got a bank here. If you right click and choose open godly table, you then get this little window. That's the godly table is the strength of the program, but the actual way we've done the godly table is pretty weak. It reflects a lot of evolutionary history in getting to where we are now. So I'm going to improve that once I get the funding for it. But that's where we're starting from. So what you do first of all is say, let's describe, start up by an asset. So click on the no asset class button. This little pop down occurs and choose asset. And then just make that reserves. And then you click on the plus key and that creates an additional column. Now notice you can see that at the same time the program's adding an output to the bottom of the table, which is the account. That's the stocks of the system. Okay, now make this a, what do I call it? Just check up here. I think I may just use. We're going to go straight across to loanable funds. So there's no lending by the bank. So I now want to have liabilities, which are the deposit accounts, and I'm going to make C_D as the consumer sector's deposit account. Okay. And what the underscore does, when you go back to Minsky and take a look at it, it makes subscripts. So this is just using some of the formatting capabilities of the language. Okay. So you've got CD turning up there. Now you click on the plus key again, that creates another column, and make the, type 1 too many, okay, then make this I_D, which is investment, the invested sector's deposit account. Then W_D for the workers' deposit account. And finally, to make the whole thing correct, click on liability and choose equity, and just make this B_E, which stands for bank equity. Okay? So it's C reserves, and C_D, I_D, W_D, and B_E. All right, done? Why do you get it done? Because I want you to do one little thing here. Let's come back here and save. Control S is the shortcut for saving. get to where you want to save it in your notes, and I'm going to just call this class 01. So if anything goes wrong, I can go back to that version. All right? You all got that much done so far? You all ready to roll to the next line? Okay, all right. Now, let's go back to the tab. I'm doing some things which I'm just used to Windows keys for. You want to get around quickly. Do you know this is a Windows shortcut?
Can you show the Godly table again?
Yeah, hold the Alt key and press Tab, and that moves between your open programs. Did you know that? Yeah. Okay, some of you don't, some of you do. Okay, there's the Godly table. So it's just reserves, then, which is an asset, 3 liabilities: consumer deposit account, investment deposit account, workers deposit account, and 1 equity account, which is the bank's equity. Okay? And I'll bring up the slideshow so you can see it at a larger scale. That easier to see? Okay. Alrighty. Okay, having done that, one thing which is everything Minsky does with the Godly table is make sure all your account definitions are consistent, and one of the elements there is your initial conditions have to add up as well. So you're going to start with some money somewhere. So I'm going to say, let's say there's 100 whatevers in the reserve account, $100 billion or whatever else. Type that in as a positive. You notice now the row sum for Minsky now says 100. Okay, so that's the check for you to make sure what you type in the remainder brings you back to 0 again, which is this consistency check in Minsky and in accounting in general. Oh, by the way, apparently there was an error in how we defined another programmer developed the transfer from the plus-minus convention I use across to credit and debit, and apparently got the liabilities side wrong, as we were told by an accountant in recent conversations. So that's being changed in the latest version. It'll look different to what I showed last week. No change in the underlying mathematical logic. It's still the same basic idea. Okay, so I'm going to say there's minus 60 is shown as the amount of money in the consumer deposit account, and that's because the consumer deposit account is a liability of the bank. It's a negative from the bank's point of view. You'll see how it turns up as a positive when you look at it from the point of view of somebody else as well later. So minus 60 there. Now the total's minus 40. Minus 20 I've chosen in investment deposit account. Minus 15 for the workers. And finally the equity. The convention you have to use is to show equity also as a negative. That way your guaranteed lines all sum to 0. Okay? So you done that? Now that's the bit. So let's keep on going. Let's move this up so we can see more clearly with the example down below. So the next thing is just to add the basic operations that apply. So lending is going to occur. Notice, by the way, there's no sign of debt in this table. Do you know why? Why does debt not turn up in this particular table?
The initial conditions show some kind of exogenous money.
No. Pardon? No. Because the debt is neither an asset nor a liability of the banking sector. Okay? We're talking about loanable funds here. The debt's going to be an asset of the consumer sector and a liability of the investment sector, so it doesn't turn up until you include those other elements in the system. Okay, so lending is going to be from the consumer sector, and the convention in Minsky is from is positive, to is negative. Okay, that applies just straight across the board. So I've got plus lend there, and to balance it I've got to type minus lend here. And then Minsky does a symbolic check that that's correct. At some stage we'll add a mathematical check as well. At the moment it's just doing a symbolic check. If we add the capability of putting in mathematical elements there, then you can have alpha going to one account and 1 minus alpha going to another. We can't quite do that yet. Okay, that's the first stage of adding. I forgot to mention, when you press the plus key here, you create an additional row. Okay? And you can also delete a row by clicking on the minus, and you can move rows up and down by using those arrow keys. So just to rearrange the tables to make them look more clear. So I've got lending, then I've got debt repayment. I'll just show that next. So I'll make debt repay. This thing here is just a label, by the way. It's the label's transferred around the program if we create other Godly tables, but it's not part of the mathematics or part of the checking of the system. And nor is this label up here, Godly 0. I was going to make that private bank. It's just a label. At some stage we might make some use of that, but at the moment it's just a text label. Okay, so there's lending. Now repayment. Well, repayment goes from the investment sector and it goes to the consumer sector. another zero sum. Click another key and then say interest payments. Well, that's going to be, of course, now you're going to show that is an income source for the bank. So I'll type int just as an abbreviation there and say the interest is paid into the equity account of the bank. That's where it, pardon me, hey, I'm thinking endogenous money straight away. Okay, that's good. That's a good mistake because I put that in the wrong spot. All right? Now I need to move it to where the neoclassicals think it happens, which is that's payment back to the consumer sector. And that's actually a teachable moment, as my mate Paul describes these things. The reason that loanable funds sees no real problem about the total level of debt, unless you get to where the zero bound happens, where interest rates are zero, and then you lose the capacity for the central bank to manipulate the economy, which of course it always had in the first place. The reason they don't particularly worry about the level of debt is they think that whatever's a gain for a borrower is a loss for a saver and vice versa. So what I've got going on here is the way the real world operates, but in fact what they think is this. If you click on INT there and then drag, notice you get that the arrow key changes to a sort of rotate set of circles, release, and it'll drop it in the right spot. You can move them up or down anywhere on the table. It's just a little way. But improve that over time. But that's if you put things in the wrong spot, you can just move them around. Okay? So you give that a try. Of course, what's going on here is, in this, you can see if the consumer sector goes up, the investor sector goes down in the amount of money. And then with the interest payments being made, the interest, which is a cost to the investment sector, is an income to the consumer sector. So everything is balanced in that sense. That's the main reason they don't see any problems with the amount of debt. Okay, and interest is there. Now let's say, what's the bank actually getting out of this? Well, the whole argument is the bank's being an intermediary. It's got to charge a fee. Okay, so I'm going to just pretend that in this case the fee is charged on the lender. You could make it more complicated, but it really doesn't make much of a difference. So type fee is the source of a payment which goes to the bank equity, and type minus fee over there. Okay, and then you've got the financial side of the economy covered. Now, I've made this it has to be moderately complicated because we are talking about two sectors. So there's quite a few steps in getting a complete model of the financial flows that are going to apply. And obviously, there's going to be higher workers by the consumption sector, and that means there's going to be a payment from the consumer sector, and I'm calling this W_C for wages from the consumer sector. You can use anything you like. You could use Swahili in there if you want to. Okay, we've got plenty of flexibility for languages, Greek, whatever you want, because Minsky supports LaTeX, so it has that capability to use any code at all. But let's just use underscores at the moment. I'll show you another trick in a moment that makes that better again. So, and then minus W_C, the wages end up in the account of the workers. Okay, and then we're going to have the consumer sector or the investment sector doing the same thing. So that's going to be a payment of W_I going from the investment sector across to the workers. Then they're going to have intermediate sectors. So if I've got, let's just call it purchases by I here. So that's effectively consumption good purchase by I. You can type anything you like there in terms of a label, so that it doesn't affect the system. So what I've got here is consumptions purchases by the investment sector. Trying to use some sort of standard way so the subscripts will have a similar meaning. Yeah.
What's WI?
W is wages by the investment sector.
So it's the money the investors pay and pay workers.
That's right. Yeah.
And then WC.
Same thing. The money that the consumer sector takes to pay wages for workers. So we've both got to hire workers to produce output. Just the same that. Okay. So we've got CI and that's their very purchase of consumer goods. Pardon me, by the investment sector. So that money goes to the investment sector. And then you're going to have investment goods purchased by the consumer sector. So that's going to go in the opposite direction. So I call that I_C, investment purchases by the consumer sector. This can get confusing, so you've got to be careful about your labelling. But at least it's making it compact. So I tend to use the subscripts quite extensively because that's actually no other program, and there's about 15 or so programs in this particular field of system dynamics. We're the only one that supports subscripts, superscripts, and Greek. Yeah, the only one using LaTeX, which I find quite strange. I could be wrong about Mathematica Model. It might have that capability as well. Okay, now workers are going to consume. So that's going to be a payment from the workers here. I'm using consumption by workers, C underscore W, means they make a payment into the consumer sector's account. And then I have bankers consume. And I'll only leave bankers consumption. I won't bother about banker investment in this particular table just because it saves a bit more definition. It's only one extra level of definition to go on. As long as I've got a flow from and to in every account, that's all I really need to show the dynamics. But as you can see in the paper model I'm doing, and for you guys in the lecture, I've included investment purchases by the banking sector as well. I'm making another mistake here. I typed that in the wrong spot. Okay, I put it in the reserves. So again, the same idea. Click in the cell, then drag, and you'll see that symbol turning up, a little rotate or flip around symbol, and then release, and you've moved the entry over. Okay? You want to add copy and paste and things like that at some stage as well, because that just takes money for programming. Okay, having done all that, now look at your Godly table and notice what's there. All these elements: lend, repay, interest, fee, workers, wages to the consumption sector, wages investment sector, consumer good purchases by investment sector, investment good purchases by consumer sector, consumption by workers, consumption by bankers. They're all there. There's flow elements. So now I'd suggest you now choose File and Save As, and I'm going to call this Class 2. So again, if anything goes wrong, you can go back and use that version. Now, let's just, I'll just shut the table down, just click and shut the window. And let's take a look in the Equation tab and see what you've defined. And what you've now got is a set of differential equations that explain the flows between those various sectors, but none of the flows themselves have been defined, and there are no parameters. Okay, can you all read that? It's a bit on the small side. Let's see if I can find it. I think I put it in here. Okay. Okay. Now let's actually go on from that, because this is still just seeing the system from the point of view of this single bank. Okay, but of course you can see it from the point of view of the workers, the investment sector, and the consumer sector. Notice these magnify icons here. If you click on the 0, that resets the origin of wherever you are to putting the edge of whatever object is in the top left at the 0, 0 position in the canvas. So that moves that lot over there. Just a little trick to move things around. And you add more Godly tables. So click on this and drag and drop over here. Click and drag and click. Whoops, I've clicked on the wrong icon. If you do that, I brought down, what's that? That's a data input. I'll just actually right click and I can choose delete the operator, get rid of it. Okay, and just because I know what's going to happen next, move those two other ones over down the bottom, out of the way, and now right click and choose Open Godly Table here, and this says it's going to be the consumer sector. Sectors view. Now, you then have to say, okay, I want to start the same sort of assets, liabilities, and equity for the consumer sector. And notice this window where you can type in a name also has a little drop-down arrow next to it. Okay? That is Minsky keeping track of all the assets and liabilities that are currently being defined in the system. So if you click, you get because somebody's liability is somebody else's asset, when you click on that of the asset button above it, it shows you all the various liabilities to be somebody else's asset. Yeah.
Figure out last time you zoomed one of them away, remember?
Pardon?
You zoomed one of them away, right? And you couldn't do anything, and then it just turned smaller. And
oh yeah, that's been fixed. Has it happened to you again?
Yeah.
Oh shit. Oh no. It's disappeared, has it? Which are you? Is that the beta you're running, or are you running the release version there? Did you double the beta?
Yeah.
Shit. Okay, Russell, pay attention. Oh, blood, we thought we'd killed that particular bug. So just. Let me check it out. Let me see. Yeah, got it, yeah. They're back now, okay. Yeah, okay, so the latest version, and then you drag them out. Okay, just quit, you're going to save yourself, that's what I said on the side. So, you're going to come back up here. I'm checking that it's actually there. Yeah, that's it. I found it.
So
Yeah.
what happens? It's when you use the zoom button. If you don't unzoom again, then it keeps zooming whatever you do.
Oh, okay, the zoom button. So it's actually.
I think it's the zoom button that just locks in.
Okay, so this one of these ones up here. These plus and minus keys here.
Yeah, if you click everything.
Okay, well before I make that mistake, I'll just save this again. Okay, and then you say if I click on the zoom button. Oh right, beauty. Russell, pay attention. Okay, thanks. That's good.
And then if you click on the zoom 0, then it stops.
Okay, I've got an error message here as well. Okay,
You
and
can operate normally. So
okay.
now you zoom out, you have to click stop again. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, but that's actually not bringing it back this time either.
Or you can zoom in.
Oh, this one's screwed completely. That's it there.
Save it.
Yeah, I have saved it. Okay, let's quit out of that. No, do not save. And then I'll go back and reload it. Okay. Yeah, so as you can say, the old saying about Tammany Hall voting in America? The principle there was vote early and vote often. Minsky, save early and save often. Okay, and so I've now got the consumer sector over here, and now if I can go back and I want to choose an asset, back to this drop-down window. It's now, because one group's asset is another one's liability, it shows me the the liabilities that haven't yet been assigned in the system. So if I click on CD for consumer deposit account, Minsky then brings across all the operations that are currently recorded for that account. Okay? And you see your row sums aren't complete yet because you've only brought across the liability. You haven't have any matching assets or equity yet. So you need to put another plus key there. Now what's an asset the consumer sector obviously has in this model? It's lend into the investment sector. This is where the debt turns up. Okay, so you type D here for debt, and that's now the asset of the consumer sector. It doesn't have any other liabilities, so you can actually ignore liabilities and go straight to equity. And I'll just call this C_E for the equity of the consumer sector. Now, I hope you can see, I'll just go back to the PowerPoint from here. I'll talk a bit through. That's what you're doing there. So you choose one of those and choose CD. You then do it, and all the operations are populated across. So once you've done that, of course, you've now got to balance the table. This is where the accounting comes in. So you now have to say, well, where do bank consumption, where does that end up? That's an income for the consumer sector. So that you have to have the matching entry there as a negative in the equity column, and that now gives you 0 there. Notice you've got no value for the debt. Let's say the debt starts at, we'll start it at 10, the initial condition of debt. That means the total, I've made a mistake there again, I'll show that in a moment too. Sometimes Minsky includes a negative as a default in a column, which it shouldn't do. So I actually put a negative asset there because I want it to be a positive asset. So just go back and you can two ways you can go. You can just delete the whole lot. You can control the control key down and move around inside the cell, and I was going to delete the 0, the minus there. Now you see the total assets are 70, so I need minus 70 to show the equity of the consumer sector. So it starts with a lot of equity. Now that's that bit. Now the next one, this is consumer good purchases by the investment sector are also an income to the consumer sector. And the next one you have is workers consume. That's also another minus to show it as an income source into equity. And the fee is what they're paying to the bank. Well, that's, you see, it's already a negative over here. So you need fee as a positive because that's, again, coming out of their income. Then you have investment purchases by the consumer sector. That's another outgoing. So it's paying money to buy intermediate goods as an input for its own production purposes. Then it's getting interest from the investment sector, so that's a negative, meaning a flow into the equity account. And then when it lends, of course, by lending it reduces... Aha! Now I've made a mistake there. Okay. What does lending actually do? And this is one reason that turns up in the banking logic later. Yeah, I've just put it in the wrong column. It's got to be shown as an increase. Lending increases the debt. So you're getting a shuffling of assets. From the point of view of the consumer sector, it's got less money in the bank, but it's got an income-earning asset, which is the debt. So I've just put lending as an entry in the D column. That creates the debt, or increases the debt the investment sector already has to the banking sector. If there's any repayment, then that reduces the asset. And finally got workers being hired here. That's another expenditure by the investment sector. So you've now got the consumer sector completely defined. Have you all got that? Okay, keep rolling. You can use the bottom table down there. I'm going to go across quickly and just save my file as class 3. Pardon me. Okay. Notice the icon's grown somewhat. Do not try to resize to fix it up later. I was getting successfully resizing the previous version, so it's yet another bug coming back. But those are the entries you have to have there. I'll go this page down. Here we go. So that's what you will have to have at the end there. What I've added as well, of course, I've put hang on, that's now still showing the transition. That's the consumer sector table. So the matching entries are in this. Okay, so that's what you're trying to reproduce. Okay, we're getting there? Yeah.
I think you have two assets columns. Why the middle one's not a liability? Because if you look there, for example, purchases I,
Yeah.
you have a CI as asset and minus CI as asset as well. Why is that?
What about you talking here?
Yeah, for example.
Well, that's the debt is an asset for the consumer sector.
Yes.
The consumer sector is lending to the investment sector. That's an asset. Okay. To lend to the consumer sector, hang on. Purchases. You're right. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. Put it in the wrong column. I didn't. That must be in the way to set up the. Okay, I haven't done it over here. So I better show you that one. Thank you for that. I had it the wrong spot. That's my mistake. So I think I'll probably fix it up later in the system. That's just going in the wrong spot.
Repay. Why is it an asset? I mean, it's a flow. It's a double time asset for the same sector, right? Like
no, it's not. Well, it's not a double asset. It's saying there's a flow of when you lend money to somebody, you take money out of your bank account and put it in theirs. Okay. When they repay you, they take money out of their account and put it in yours.
Yeah, but so that middle column is a different sector.
No, it's showing the asset. The debt is an asset of the consumer sector.
Just
you have multiple
obligations
assets.
serving in the
Then you
money.
have 30 or 40 different assets. This is saying the debt is an asset of the consumer sector, and so is the bank account of the consumer sector. So you're now seeing them as two assets.
And then two bank accounts.
Yeah. Well, no, one's a bank account. The other's what you're keeping in your drawer back at home. Okay? Because from the point of view of loanable funds, banks don't create money. They don't create debt. They simply let savers lend to investors. So the bank has no record of the amount of debt in the world. It's all kept by people back on their spreadsheets back at home on their laptop. Okay?
So what's that table saying in the consumer sector?
Yeah.
The consumer sector creates a loan, and the loan stays inside the consumer sector.
Yeah, well, the consumer sector creates the loan to the investment sector and keeps a record of it itself and charges interest on that. And then all the transactions occur through the banking tables. Okay. So in that sense, this is one of the weird things about the loanable funds model. It puts debt outside the financial sector. Yeah.
So basically then, I've got a debt, I've got a piece of paper at home which says that I owe somebody money or I...
Well, if you lend to Mads, you've got a paper saying Mads owes me $100.
Right, so at home I've got a paper saying Mads owes me $100.
Yeah.
And I've got minus $100 in my bank account.
You've gone down, that's what...
Transferred from my bank account to his bank.
That's right, yeah. Yeah.
I wanted that. I don't think he's a good credit.
And
So-
the reason why there are two assets there is because they both in the same sector. Is that how?
Well, it's actually, just think about it, if you actually let's say I borrowed $100 off you. Okay. I hope you'd write down in the book somewhere that I owe you $100. Okay. So you went from having only cash as your only asset to cash plus the debt. Right? It's just the debt from Steve came to you. Okay. So you've now two types of assets. By transferring money from one spot to another, you've created a new asset class for yourself. So you have multiple different sorts of assets.
I see that I have one asset that's the debt you owe me in the paper.
Yeah.
But what's my other asset?
You're checking, well, with money in your money in your wallet or your bank
the
account.
money's gone because it's I gave it to you. But
Only some of it. You've still got money in your account. If I borrow 100, I hope you've got more than $100 in your account.
No, yes.
Yeah,
That sense,
okay.
yes. But okay, yeah.
It's just lending. You might have, say you got £1,000 in your account. You lend 100 of it to Mads. You've got £900 in your account, and a debt of 100 that Mads owes to you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. So now I've got that defined. Now come back and check the table. Then now you've got quite a complex view of the system. But there's now two more to go, and let's just choose this one and right-click, open the Godly table, and make this the investment sector. Okay, again the same story, choose assets. What are the available assets? You're now down to two assets because you've already allocated the consumer deposit account to a consumer sector. Choose ID, and now all the operations that exist between coming out of the account of the investment sector now turn up in the column, in the table. Let's go back and show that in a second. Okay, well, but we now need to click in here, and now of course the investment sector has a liability as well, which is the debt it owes to the consumer sector. So you now click down here, you'll find there's two assets that haven't been allocated, which are therefore liabilities elsewhere in the system. One is reserves, so I can put a central bank in here by clicking on that, choosing it as an asset of the central bank. But I'm going to ignore that for the moment and just choose D as the debt, as the liability that the investment sector owes to the consumer sector. And when I do that, Minsky populates it with the relevant entries. So as you can see, lending and repayment are operations that already occur on that debt column. They get transferred across. Yeah.
What did you call those in the variables in the consumer sector?
Exactly the same. Yeah. It brings across exactly what the operations are called elsewhere in the system. So it maintains that consistency between different interlocking bank accounts. So you've now got 4 entries for lend and repay. Okay. You show lend and repay twice in the bankers column. Okay, and once each in the investment sector and the consumer sector's column. So one of the principles of double entry, and you'll find this written, Minsky makes the same comment, to properly account for all financial transactions, every transaction has to be recorded 4 times. Okay. And that's what we're doing here. Same thing applies when you take a look at a transfer between 2 banks. If you're transferring money by buying from somebody who banks at a different bank. Okay, so we've now got to balance this whole thing out. So we now need to look at the equity of the investment sector. So I_E for their equity. And you already know they've got a 20 pounds in their deposit account. They owe 10. It's a liability to the consumer sector. So they have a net equity position which is shown as -10, okay, for that consistency. So you've now got, when I type that in there, the row sum now goes to 0. So the same sort of story now for all the other operations. So consumer good purchases by the investment sector, that's an outflow of money. Might be why they borrowed the money in the first place. Investment goods purchases by the consumer sector is an inflow. I've made a mistake there. Notice that I typed a positive. What Minsky does is record I've got 2 times that entry is my row sum. It's got to be 0. Every row has to be 0. That's your stock flow consistency check. Or that every flow, as Wynne Godley say, every flow starts somewhere and goes somewhere. So Minsky's making sure you record those financial flows properly. So what you do there, click in the cell, hold the control key down and press the left arrow key until you get at the front there, and then type minus, and now it'll do the sum properly. Okay? So now the other operations, we have interest payments. Well, that's That's interest payment by the investment sector to the consumer sector. That's taking money out of their equity account, so it's a positive entry there. Lending and repayment are already shown. And then finally you've got to hire workers, which is another outflow. Okay, so you've now got that column properly, that table properly shown. Let's go back over here, and you can see all the elements turning up here. I'm now going to save this again as a different file. So again, keep on doing this. It's essential practice until we get a long way further in developing Minsky. So that's it for the workers. I'll see the workers quickly. There's much less dynamics for the workers' account because they haven't got them doing any borrowing at the moment. So go and look, okay, what are the available assets that haven't yet been allocated? Click on the down arrow. Only the workers' deposit account is left as an asset and allocated, and there are their transactions. Click to add another column. They don't have any liabilities. You can bring that in later if you wanted to for a model, but let's just leave them out at the moment. So you now have W_E for workers' equity. Since all I've got is an asset of 15, their equity is shown as minus 15. When they consume, they're spending money, and when this is wages being paid from the consumer sector, and wages being paid from the investment sector. Okay, so having done that, again I'll save it again. I'd rather have too many copies of something and only have one copy that's been stuffed up. Yeah, sure. Can you see that? It's a bit small, but that's the workers table. So W_D is the asset, that's the deposit account. W_E for their equity, and just make where there's a positive entry, just make a matching negative. Not bad. Again, I'd like one thing. I want to be able to rescale the godly tables as well, which we can't do at the moment. I can't make that any bigger unless I change screen resolution. Yeah.
You know, I understand why you didn't put a liability there for this godly one, but I don't understand why you didn't put one for the consumer sector, and at the same time you put one for the investment sector.
It's too simple a model at the moment because, as I've defined it, the consumer sector, let's go back and take a look at the consumer sector. The investment sector has one asset, one liability, and its equity. The consumer sector has two assets, no liabilities, and equity. Okay? So if I had the consumer sector borrowing from the banking sector, provide the consumer sector, its consumer sector has got to be in debt to somebody else, effectively, or have some transaction. For example, what I could add, even if there has to be an additional debt they have, some sort of obligation. Otherwise, there's no point giving them a liability. Okay? Yeah. Thanks for the question. This is the sort of stuff that helps clarify for everybody, and it's going to be useful on YouTube as well. Okay, so what we finally get, after you've done all that, is that mass of tables. And pardon me, the text is just too tiny to read. Probably see it if you go back and use it on your laptop, but that's the overall pattern you've defined. Now let's just take a look at the equations in that sense from Minsky, and that's the set of equations. You've only added, all we've done by adding the additional columns in there, like the additional godly tables, what have we added? What's the only thing we've added by putting there's two things. We added debt. Okay, we had to have debt there because in the model there is no debt, the banking sector has no debt, so we added debt. We've also just added the equity for the other three accounts. Okay, the bank equity already had. We've now added equity for the workers, consumer sector, and the investment sector. That's a complete. Except we haven't got reserves in there, but we added a central bank and had that, but that doesn't become relevant in this particular illustration. So now to find the overall system. Now what we need to do is define the flows, and in a more sophisticated model, you'd have feedback from wage demands for workers for setting wages and all this sort of stuff. Investment returns, capital appreciation, etc., etc. But with what I've got here, I'm going to define all the flows as functions of the stocks. Okay. So what you have to do now is grab the various elements here, lend, repay, interest, etc., etc., and define them. And at the moment, you've got to grab them one by one. We don't have. I want to again make it possible to grab them all and just place them around for definition. I'll just show one little thing, which is just to illustrate this can be done. Let's say I want to define interest there. Notice when I move over any of the bank icons, little circles turn up. Okay, those are the linking points to link one variable to another. So if I come down here, I have investment by, let's see, wherever I've got debt. I've got debt over here. Now this is going to be bloody ugly, but it's still worth taking a look at. What is interest on debt? How would I define interest? It's the rate of interest on loans multiplied by the outstanding level of loans. Okay, so I need an equation doing that. So what I want to do is multiply this debt level by the rate of interest. I've got to define a rate of interest. So I'm going to type R underscore L over there, and that's going to be the R rate of interest on loans. Okay, and then I want to multiply that. And what again, when Minsky is the only program that does this in the field. I'm sure one of these days they'll copy us. But if you just want to type a multiply key, you simply type one on the keyboard. Hold down the Shift key, press the star key, which is the shortcut used in Excel for multiply, and that'll give you a multiply block. So if I now drag from the circle, as soon as I go on the RL, if I click outside the two circles, I can move the object around. If I click inside the circle, I drag an arrow out. That's an assignment key. So that says, no, not RL multiplied by. But there's nothing multiplied by there yet. Now I'm going to make this very ugly, but I want to illustrate a point here. Okay, now I've got RL multiplied by the level of debt, and I can drag this down here, and that's the level of interest. Okay, and then if you take a look on the equations now, go across to the equations tab, you've now got interest is equal to rate of interest on loans multiplied by debt. So you can do it that way, but you imagine how ugly that's going to get. So that's just to illustrate you can do it that way. What the preferable trick is if you right-click on any of these inputs, which are here, the flows, or outputs, which are down here, you get two options, edit or copy. Edit's a legacy, it's going to go. It just happens to be something we used to do earlier in the program. Just copy it. And then you notice you can just see the icons turned up there. When you drag it sideways, you've now got, I've grabbed the wrong one, I grabbed CE. Let's go back here and I'll just right click and choose copy D and bring debt over here. And notice that arrow, when I go near the arrow, a little dot turns up on the arrow. That's got two functions. One to show you've actually selected the arrow. The other, if you click on the dot, okay, you can curve it. And once you've curved it once, you then get other curve points that turn up. So you can curve it again, you know. You can do all sorts of, whoops, you know. Whereabouts are we? I'm pushing my luck here by having it sitting on top of the godly icon, so I'm trying to grab that extra dot, but I can't do it. It switches across. But yeah, you can twist the lines around. But I want to get rid of that line. So once I actually got those dots pointing up, if I press the delete key, I can delete the wire. Okay. I want to drag from this version of D across to here. So there's defining the rate of interest. And again, let's make it less messy. I can take a copy of interest as well, whack that over here, delete that line, and drag that up to interest. And now I've defined it. Pretty ugly. Let's fix it up a bit. If you click and drag around a set of icons and then release, they all go grey. Now this is still, we have to improve this code as well. This is a very early version of it. If you now right click, not on one of the objects, but in the region where those greys are defined, you get the option for group. So click on group. That's one of the bugs. Okay, the arrows should all be inside the system. They shouldn't be sticking out. There's another problem with the beta. Now I move and notice they go inside. So now I can drag this box over here. Notice you're still seeing it turning up over there, which again is another bug. If I now right click and choose ungroup, it's moved them over there, and now I can just sort of sort things out a bit, make it look a bit neater. So that's a cumbersome way of showing you the basic design process, but that's what you do, taking elements off the godly table, whacking them on the canvas, and then defining them over in the system over here. I'm just going to, I want to move, and these are all getting in the way now. I've probably defined all I want to have here, so I'm going to take a risk. I'll save this 7 or 6. And I want to just zoom out a bit, and click the minus key. You reckon it's going to cause that disaster, guys?
I would press the zoom 0.
If I press the zoom 0, it goes back to the same scale again. Yeah. So I'm going to take a real risk. I've saved it in a previous version, so it's okay. I can click and drag. If I hold the Shift key down, and you notice how the cursor changes from an arrow to a positioner. That means you can drag the whole thing around. So this is actually a canvas of 100,000 by 100,000 points. So at some stage we'll have monitors that big, but that's the idea. You're going to have a huge design space to design. You know, you could put the European economy on this system. Okay, now here we go. Risk time. Click. There we go. Okay. Bug. So file. Quit. Do not save. Okay. Come back and let's load that one again. So I've got to do it the laborious way. This is actually a useful exercise. Russ is going to sit through a whole bloody lecture of mine, but that's life. Okay. What I suggest doing is instead, I'm going to click here and just whack it over here and move this one over as well. And notice I've got this CE sitting over here. I'll just delete that. If I now click the 0 key, it didn't reset properly. That's intriguing. There we go. There it did. So now I've got them moved over a bit. I can repeat the process, move them sideways. So now, and I'll move that one over there as well. So now I want to move this back, so I'm going to rubber band around it, right click, choose group, click and drag pardon me. Click and drag the group over here, right click, pardon me, ungroup, so now it's over there to work on. And we've gone actually past the first hour. We want to take a break at that point. Okay, I'll just save this now as number 7.
Can you open the...
You're just nothing at all, 7. What a pain, Mads. Okay, I'll just watch somebody else's working PC and we'll have to take it from there. But that's weird, with nothing turning up on the Mac at all. Okay, now this is showing you the definitions I've finally set up, but I'll go through defining some in this table over here. So what you need to do is to grab each of these flows and define them in terms of the stock. So if you come over here, I'll notice, by the way, there's another little bug. Notice how that grab cursor there, the square cursor, is there. Something I've done is generally that, and it hasn't reset back to the pointer, and that's a bit of a pain. So I'm just going to save this yet again. I'll make it 8, and then shut it down and start again. And now I should have my pointer back. Okay. So what I want to do is it's so in some ways the palette that you can bring the mathematical operators is rather trigger happy. I must have clicked as I went past and I've grabbed an icon there. You can see it's attached to the cursor. I can just right click and choose delete operator to get rid of it. So a little hint there. So I've defined interest. Now I want to define all the other elements as well here. So this is consumption by the banking sector. So I'm going to right click and choose copy that, bring it over here. Now consumption by the banking sector is going to be based on the amount of money the banking sector has. Okay, just a simple way of defining it. So if I right click and choose CE for consumer consumption, that's consumer sector. I want the bank. That's over here. I better label that as bank. Okay, so there's the bank labelled properly. So I want to base the spending by the banking sector on the amount of money it has. So I'm going to copy BE over here and base consumption by the banking sector on the banking sector's equity. Okay. Now I'll use time constants. I want to enforce that as an idea because it's just better than using the sort of blank parameters that a lot of post-Keynesian models use, because it ties in with the time dimensions of the system. And ultimately Minsky is going to have all sorts of dimensional checking as well to make sure your time dimensions are okay. And I want to show you what that looks like in one of the later slides as well. But using time constants actually says you're dividing something by the number of years that it takes something to turn over. So I've got BE, that's the amount of money in the bank equity account. Okay? And that's dollars. That's dimensioned as dollars. The flow of spending by the banking sector is dollars per year. Okay? So if I divide the stock by the time constant, it's dividing dollars by years, and therefore the flow is dollars per year. So that's doing the dimensional checking for you. At some stage, Minsky will enforce that and point out if you make any dimensional errors like that, but we haven't had time to write the code yet. And for the convention in using time constants is use the Greek word letter tau for t as the indicator of a time constant. So the way you generate that in Minsky, you type a backslash key and type tau, which is tau. Okay. Then I'm going to use subscripts as well. So I type the underscore key, that gives me a subscript. And I want to then have a consumption by the banking sector. So I'm going to have CB as my indicator of that consumption by the banking sector. So I type a curly bracket, CB, close curly bracket, and that creates tau CB. You done that? Okay. Now I want to divide bankers' equity by the time constant for consumption by bankers, and that will give me the rate of consumption per year by work bankers. So I press the divide by key, and then I can just wire up those components, and I've defined that that flow. But there's still a problem here, and that is the consumption by bankers. What am I dividing? The default value is 0. Okay. So what am I doing? I'm dividing by 0. Okay. It's going to cause a crash if I try to run. I'll save it as it is. So I'll save that as 9. Okay, I'll actually try running it and see what happens. Here we go. Okay, so it's doing an error check for you, so you can get dividing by 0 at that point. So, and notice there's also a little circle turns up around the divide by symbol, so that's where the error is. So this is all to help you find where you make mistakes. So what you've got to do is right-click here and choose Edit. Now there's some hassles in the editing. I've still got to get these things. These are particular bugs that just keep on turning up. But I want to say, let's say the bankers have got a lot of money, so if they're going to spend their accounts to 0, it'll take them a lot of years. Let's say it'll take them 2 years. Okay? So the time constant is 2 in that case. And that says whatever amount of money they've got in the bank accounts, their rate of expenditure of that is every 2 years effectively. So I do that. Okay, and now if I try running that, of course that's the only part that's being defined, but it does now run. You'll see the time clock clicking over here when you click on run. So you've got bankers' equity defined there, and consumption by bankers. So that's the first one you need to define.
You define the tau as flow, isn't it, for the parameters?
Pardon?
You define the tau as
a flow, yep. we have 4 types of variables in Minsky. But we still have, this is still like a developmental idea, so we can define, if you see this drop down, there's flows, constant, parameters and integrals. So the idea is to be able to, first of all, define something as being one of those entities and then be able to translate from one to the other. So you might start, for example, with population as a constant. You're not looking at population growth. Then you might make it a variable, so you see what happens if you use a slider to change population coming into the country. Then you can make it an integral as well, so you've got population growth going on. So those are all elements there. But at the moment, that's not complete. So I just leave everything defined as a flow. There are various hassles. What parameters do is, with a parameter, if you define a flow, then it's going to have an input and an output. Okay? Define a parameter, it's just going to have an outflow, an output. It won't have an input. You set the value of a parameter. An integral block will be something which has a flow that causes it the stock to rise or fall. But let's just leave it there at the flow. Now what I want to do is make this into a slider, and I'll show you the way that I prefer to do this. Make a copy of tau CB, drag it up here, and then right click and choose slider. Come inside and edit it. I'm going to give it a range of anything, say 5 years, which means we've got oodles of money and takes tons of time to spend, or 0.5. They're in Great Gatsby mode, they're spending a fortune, following a lot of essential cocaine. Okay, and I've got a step size of 0.01. So what I can do when I'm running the program is I can vary that dynamically, and there's 2 ways to do it. You either grab the slider and use the mouse to drag it along, or when you put the mouse over the number, you can use the right and the left arrow keys to change the value. You can do that while the simulation is running. And you'll also, if you want to make big changes, hold the control key down. and that moves in larger steps. But I'll start, pardon me, I'll start with one for the meantime. So that's the basic thing I want you to do with all those various elements there. And it may take a long time to get this defined, so I might actually use the dongle and pass over a finished one in a moment. But let's get a couple more defined. So that's consumption by bankers. Let's now define consumption by the consumption by the investment sector. So that's actually, I might move these tables around. I want to primarily work from the bank table. So it's going to drag this over here, so the bank table is the one that's most handy. Okay. And now I've got lending, repayment, interest, the fee, etc. These are all in the order that I defined them initially. You remember that. When Minsky does the transfers the values across to another table, it doesn't necessarily put them in the same order that they started in. So then there's interest, lending and repayment are all down here. If you want to move things around, just use the arrow keys, one press at a time, and you move all the operations up. That's putting lending up the top of that, and I'll do the same for interest and repayment. Let's see. Okay, that's a bit more set out the same way the other table was set out. Let's save it again. So now I want to define lending. So right click there, choose copy. Lending I'm going to define over here. Right click on repayment, copy, drag over here. Interest I've already defined. Fee is going to depend upon the amount of money made out of the interest by the bank. So I'm going to actually define that one right now. So I've got interest here. You imagine the fee that the bank would charge for this service would be based on the amount of interest being earned by the consumer sector. So I'm going to simply say let's say the bank fee is 30% of the interest. Okay. So I'm going to B underscore F the fee and give that a value of 0.3 and then multiply the interest flow by the bank fee by the bank fee rate to work out what the fee actually is, and that's now to find the fee that is the income for the banking sector. Okay? Yeah.
So you started with the bank table,
Yeah.
and then you added the other three.
Yeah.
Did you need to add the other three? Would the program run if you just had the bank table, or is there something that's not actually defined in that?
Yeah, there's only one thing that's not defined in the bank one, and that's the debt level. So we're not.
So if you tried to run it with just the bank table, what would happen?
Well, you wouldn't have the debt. You'd have the interest payments, but you wouldn't have the actual level of debt being recorded there. So what you'd need to do, and this is why when I
the program would still run. The
program would still run. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's just what I used to do before we had multiple godly tables. If I wanted to simulate loanable funds, what I had to do was set up an icon for the financial flows, and then define a separate variable called D, which was debt. Okay, and then lending and repayment change the level of debt, and they were integrals. So I had the D would be create an integral object, which is from here. If you see the integral symbol here, okay, I had to do that, bring it down, then define debt. Because in this case, your question earlier, the debt is not an asset or a liability of the banking sector. So I'm going to record it. I can't record it on a godly table for the banking sector.
So if you had some model, it wouldn't necessarily be. You wouldn't necessarily have to kind of complete the whole thing. You could say, I'm only interested in the evolution of the banking, the amount of fees the bank sector earns.
Yeah.
And then you could just have the banking.
Yeah, you could.
You've got some variable in the background which you're not really recording or managing, but within what you actually defined, it's all evolving.
And most of the papers you'll see that I use with Minsky, I use a single table. But to actually illustrate this, the beauty of doing it with the double tables is I can rapidly redefine the debt as not being an asset of the consumer sector, being an asset of the banking sector. And the double entry tables, hang on, what happened there? Back up again? The banking sector tables, maybe we do that really easily. It's actually complicated without it. Why have we lost our screen? What's happening here? I can't continue the lecture if you guys can't see what I'm showing. Input. It's a nice colour. Isn't only my Minsky that has bugs. Okay, what do I do? I better shut that down and restart, I imagine. Okay. Okay. Is it starting up again? Okay, so that's the reason for having the multiple tables, because debt's inside there. But I could have left the workers table out. Okay, because there's nothing the workers table adds that's part of the dynamics of the system that's not already included in the banking sector, because they don't have any assets or liabilities that are not relative to the banking sector. So I need three. I need the banking sector, the consumer sector, and investment sector. And I'll show you why I need those three when we go across and change from loanable funds to endogenous money. Because there's lending and repayment. I'm just going to base lendings. Who's doing the lending? It's consumer sector. So what's going to control what they lend from? Hang on. Amount of money they've got in their bank account. Okay. So I'm going to say their lending, their time constant for lending is relative to the amount of money they've got to lend, which is the money shown in their... What is wrong here? Hang on. All right, okay. I was going to cursor again. Bugs. It just takes money to pay, get hunted down and killed. Okay, so there's lending. I want to base lending on the amount of money in the consumer deposit account. So I come across here and right-click and choose copy, bring it up here. Now I'm going to have a time constant for lending, so I'm going to make that tau underscore L for lending. And I've mistyped it. You can see I typed TRAU, so the slash is turned up and the lowercase. If I just click and choose edit, then I can come up here and just change that definition. So get rid of the R, let's stuff that up. And now I'm going to give it a value of, say, 7 years, meaning if the consumer sector lent at a constant rate, it would exhaust its, and no money was flowing back in, it'd exhaust its account in 7 years. Okay? So a fairly slow rate of lending, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, there's tau L. So I now have that, and I divide the consumer deposit account by tau L. I get lending. Then repayment, this is now looking from the investment sector's point of view. It's trying to repay its debt. So I want to now bring up, this is why I need D over here. So I right-click here and choose copy of debt. I'm going to have a rate of repayment, so I'm going to call that tau underscore R for repayment. And I'll give that a value of, say, 9 years. So over 9 years, if they did nothing other but repay their debt, their bank accounts would fall to zero. And then divide there. So debt divided by the time constant for repayment is the rate of repayment. Okay, and now let's just actually grab a few of these and drag them up so we can use them as variables. So I'm going to copy the rate of interest, whack it there, copy the time constant for lending, and copy the time constant for repayment up here, and then right click and make each of them into a slider. And notice that's 0, that's 0, and that's 0. Another error that turns up in the programs. For some reason, sometimes when you define a slider, it resets the value of the parameter back to 0 again, which is a pain. So, but we're stuck with it. So now I've done this, I can now go inside and edit this. So I'm going to say the rate of interest, say, is 5%, and I'm going to have a range between a maximum of 20% and a minimum, because we're talking commercial banks here, of 2%, and with step size of 1. And then I'm going to go back and reset that to, say, 5%. Time constant for lending, give it a value of, say, 7 years, maximum of 20, which is really slow lending, minimum of 2, which is really fast lending, and a step size of 1. And now I've got to go back and again set that value up to, say, 7. And then repayment, same story. Give it, say, a value of 9. It'll lose the value, unfortunately. 20, 2, and a step size of 1. And now I've got to go back and say, let's make that 9. Okay. So I'll now save it at this stage. And I'll stop using. So, who's successfully followed me so far? Doing okay? Sort of. Okay. What I'll do is where's that data dongle? The USB stick. Have I stolen my own stick? Here we go. Got it. Yep. Okay. What I'll do is I'll copy across the final version because I've done all the other definitions here. So, okay, the final one I want to copy across is Loanable Funds 06. Oh, hang on a sec, where did it get to? Okay. So, I know we're pushing our luck here, Mads, but give it a try and see if it works for you. Just pass them down the line. It's Loanable Funds 06. Okay? So copy that one across. I'll go across to back to the lecture again now. So that's the basic sort of story. You take a stock level, you divide it by a time constant, you've got the rate of flow. It can be more complicated than that if it's more realistic. So it's possible to have all sorts of second order effects and integrals turning up and all that sort of jazz. So there's the money in the consumer sector, which is dollars, okay? And you got a flow of lending, which is dollars per year, and you're dividing it by years. That's one of the reasons that time constants are a superior way of stating this stuff to just using straight, numerical parameters. Okay, because then with a numeric actually what you're using is 1 over the year, multiplying by 1 over the year, which is not as straightforward. I prefer using that just for clarity of the dimensions of the time flows that are going on. So similar definitions apply for all the others except interest rates, of course, where you're multiplying the debt by the interest rate. The bank fee, where I've got a fraction of interest payments being defined, and I've got a share of surplus going to capitalists as annual turnover. Now, actually, somebody on YouTube made an interesting comment a couple of days ago saying there was an error in the table because the numbers didn't add up. What's actually going on there, and I'll illustrate that with the Loanable Funds version. Have I said I forgot that? Recent files doesn't work, by the way. Another problem. Which we'll get to one of these days. So here's Loanable Funds 06. You can see I've done a fair bit of defining there, okay, including graphs and stuff like that. What I have is, when you look at all the flows that are in and out of these accounts, effectively I've collapsed the capitalists who own the consumer sector. Hey, is it working? Yay, good one. Okay. God, what happened with the other ones there? So I collapsed the firms and the capitalists. So there's profit being generated because I've got wages going out, which are 1 minus S times GDP. So S times GDP still exists and is turning over inside the firm sector, but implicitly. The way you can make it explicit is to have the firm sector and having capitalists who own the firm sector, all profits are paid across to the capitalists who then pay them back into the firm. And then you've got explicitly you're covering the expenditure of profit as buying output of each of the sectors. So that's another trick, but I won't bother with that here. That's just going to complicate the tables too much. So what I've done here, as you can see, I've got lending by the consumer sector, repayment by the investment sector, rate of interest on loans, bank fee, turnover. This is one thing I explained to you last week was that to generate the GDP, you've got the amount of dollars in the account turning over so many times per year, which is Marx's turnover rate. So if I divide the amount of money by the turnover rate, I get the amount of output being generated by that sector in monetary terms. And the ambition, of course, is to integrate that with physical flows later, which we'll do when I get to talking about Minsky later. But that's what the TC there, that's the turnover period, how often the money in the sector turns over. Okay, so it's the time to go from M to M plus, to use both Marx's terms and the way Philippe Rochon spoke about it. That's the share of surplus going to the consumer sector, that's the turnover rate for investment sector, share of investment of output going to the capitalists in the investment sector, workers' consumption, which is 0.04 of a year, otherwise, pretty close to a fortnight. And that's with workers, if they spent their money, they'd run out of money in a fortnight to a month. So that's why it's a low number. Investment by the consumer sector, that's the amount of time, again, the time constant of expenditure by the consumer sector buying investment sector inputs. And this is the same thing in the opposite direction. Time by the, other way around, but time constant of the consumer sector buying from the investment sector and vice versa. So those are the intersectoral flows that are necessary for both sectors to produce output. Okay? So you've got a reasonably okay, simple model there. What I want to now do is say what actually happens if you run it first of all. Well, you'll notice everything's settling down to equilibrium rates here. GDP plunged from the initial level because I said the initial conditions were just chosen at random. They're consistent, but they weren't consistent with the equilibrium of the system. So the system takes a while to reach its equilibrium. It's running very slowly here, which is another bug in this version. It should be much faster than that, but that'll do for the illustration I'm doing here. Now let's see what happens if we vary the rate of lending. Now 7 years says banks, the lending agent takes 7 years to empty their account for lending. What if they lend more quickly? That might take 5 years. So you just press the arrow key and go sideways and see what happens. And notice down here we're seeing the level of debt is now rising. And repayment and say takes 9 years for the investment sector to repay the debt. What do they take a lot longer time, say 20 years? Well, then you get an increase in debt. And you can see there's a rising amount of debt in the system, but absolutely no change in the amount of money. In loanable funds, there is no link between debt and money. Your system's running okay, or are they slow? Yeah, this is very slow. It's 10 times faster. I'm sure this is the latest version, but it's 10 times. There's a speed bug that keeps on coming back, slowing the system down. So I've got to check and see which version that is, again for Russell's benefit. But keep the simulation running. So you can see now there's more debt in the system than there is money. But there's no relationship between debt and money in that system. And notice GDP's changed a bit. It rose a bit and it's fallen back down again. But we've been simulating this for 41 years now. And GDP is still running at a constant level. And I've had a drastic change in the level of debt in the system. So if I had a debt to GDP ratio, it would now be quite substantial. Actually, we can put that graph in there. Let's just to get that done, I'll show you the idea of graphing. You click on a graph icon, drag and place that somewhere on the screen. Now I want to divide debt by the debt to GDP ratio, so I'm going to take a copy of D, and take a copy of, if I define GDP properly, the GDP there in dollar terms, so right click and choose a copy of that. And then we're just going to do a straight look at. Pardon? Pardon?
How do you add the graph?
I'm showing. Oh, does you see the graph icon here?
Okay.
Click on that and drag. And click to release somewhere on the canvas. So do that. Drag across to that icon. So I'll just stop the system and start it again. And I'll start with the same initial conditions: 7 years to lend and 9 years to repay. Ooh, cute. Okay, another bug. All right, so I've got to. I don't think I saved that, so I'm going to pay a price there. Okay, so I lost that particular edition, but I'll rapidly do it again. So a copy of D, copy of GDP, bring across a graph, click, divide by, wire up D to the numerator, GDP to the denominator, bang, over here. I'm going to save this as 06B. Okay, and now simulate. Sometimes the graph won't run again. Just hit, if that happens, if the graph doesn't actually write, hit stop and restart again. And now you can see a debt to GDP ratio turning up over there as well. So let's now increase the rate of lend. Oh, now it's running quickly. Notice the speed's dramatically faster now. Up to 160, 170 years right now. So sometimes changing a definition in the middle of it slows the program down. If that happens, to go back and reload it. All sorts of bugs we need to fix up on. Now I'm going to have repayment being really slow. And notice debt to GDP ratio is going through the roof. If you want to see what a value is, I'll just pause it. You can do this while it's running live, but it's easier to pause. If you right-click on any object, you'll see its values. And the output of that port is now 0.62, saying the debt to GDP ratio is 62% at the moment. Okay. Whereas money, because money's turning over, down here I've got velocity down here, can't quite see it. I'll bring it up a bit. But velocity of money here, money's turning over 2.6 times a year. So the GDP is higher than the amount of money in existence, which again is this point about the circuitous mistake last year of thinking the amount of stock of money determines the total GDP. No, it doesn't. It's a function of that, but it's not. It doesn't set the maximum value. Okay, having done that, now let's go right back again. Notice trivial change to GDP. Let's go back and continue simulating. And now I'm going to have much faster repayment, so debt plunges, and much lower lending, so debt plunges even further. And still, bugger all change to GDP. Let's go back to the initial situation again. So say 7 years to lend, 9 years to repay. So we've run through 750 simulation years there. Dramatic changes to the level of debt in the economy. Bugger all change to GDP. Okay, that's the neoclassical position. You can ignore banks' debt and money. And if they're right about loanable funds being the actual institutional structure of lending, they'd be right about ignoring them too, which of course they're not. So I'll just save that again. Let's see. Okay. Now, what I wanted, this is the real trick behind Minsky, because that's using it to show that particular lunatic idea. Somehow I got away with shrinking the graphs in the other version, but I'm not quite certain how I managed to do that, given the hassles we've seen today. Those are the details there. So if you want to, I've set it up so if you want to actually run any of the programs, just run the slideshow and then click on the icon, and that will load that particular version if you've got it installed. Okay, so if you download the PowerPoint slides, you've all got copies of all these various Minsky simulations. So test the model. That's shown you the output, all those variations to the level of lending, bugger all difference to GDP. And this comes down to that point that that Bernanke made. Outside, extremely large, implausible differences in marginal propensities to consume, no particular macroeconomic impact. Well, let's actually make a really, really weird assumption that actually, let's assume they lend money. What do they originate? Well, let's see if we can show that in Minsky. So let's go back to that version I've got here. And what I'm showing at the moment, if I bring up the consumer sector's Godley table, I'm saying the debt is an asset of the consumer sector. Now, notice there's plus and minus keys up here. If I press the minus key, I have to delete a column. So I'm deleting that column there. And I can do the same thing in the rows. So I'm deleting thank you. I'm going to delete the lending, interest, repayment and bank fee columns there. And now because the debt's no longer shown as an asset of the consumer sector, their initial conditions of their equity is lower as well, because their equity is not 70, it's 60, because I've just taken the debt away from them. So that's now made that table consistent. Okay. And they want to come across to the banking sector and say, let's just assume the bank lends money. So I'll come across to the asset here. Let's make that window a bit wider so you can see it more clearly. So now these four operations, because the transfers are still being shown as happening between the sectors, because I've deleted debt as an asset for the consumer sector, but I haven't deleted it as a liability for the investment sector. So Minsky still knows it's in the system. So if I now click here and say let's create an additional asset for the banking sector, what are the unallocated liabilities elsewhere in the system? It's debt. Then Minsky brings those operations across on the rows where they're defined. Pardon me. So I've got still the payment of interest being defined by the investment sector, but not where it's going to, because I've deleted that entry for the asset of the consumer sector. And we've got the fee. Well, let's get rid of the bank fee, because that's a little neoclassical fiction. Yes, banks charge fees, but they're mainly in the game of creating money. So I delete that column. And now to make it balanced, I have to simply say, well, the interest is actually paid not to the investment sector, but to the bank. So I type INT here, minus INT. That's now correct. And of course, the bank equity includes the loan. So it's got 15, not 5. So that's consistent. And the one little thing, you notice I've got a little trick down the bottom, which is a new feature in one of the later versions of the program. It's what's called a switch function, or a case function. Who's done programming here? None of you. Okay. You know the idea of if, then, else statements. If something applies, then follow, otherwise. There's another thing called a case statement. So a particular case applies, then that value is used, otherwise a different value is used. Notice I've got banks, lenders, 0 here. And notice this little block here, this is the case statement. It's currently wired to the top entry saying the amount of lending depends upon the amount of money in the consumer's deposit account. Now if we're going to have the bank lending money, then the amount of lending it's going to do depends upon its equity in a more complicated model. But here I'm saying it's based upon its the level of outstanding debt. So if I simply hit this switch, it now says, but I'll just actually stop the model and take one step. Notice now, bank lending is a function of the debt level of the firm, rather than the amount of the consumer's deposit account. So those are all the changes I've made. Everything else about the model is exactly the same. There's no change in any of the other logic. So the only thing is I've gone across from endogenous loanable funds to endogenous money, from where banks are intermediaries to where banks are originators. So what happens when we simulate this model? Always click the stop, and I'll just save as again, just before I try to do the simulation. So I'll make that loanable funds D. Okay, we simulate away, and we're in a different universe. Notice GDP is now rising, which it wasn't doing beforehand, because the creation of new money, which is happening very slowly here, again the simulation's running slowly. That's okay for this current illustration. I'll speed it up later. And the increasing amount of debt is actually driving up the money. What's the difference between the two there, by the way? Notice money and debt are not the same in the model. We've got reserves in there. Okay, so effective reserves are money created. Well, not reserves. The money that people put in the bank as reserves is money that's been created by the government running a deficit. And I haven't got central banking here, but I could easily bring that in. So you can see now the bank accounts are rising, GDP is rising. What happens if you lend more rapidly? So lending goes from every 7 years to every 5. Well, the rate of growth of the economy picks up. You can see this tiny tick down the bottom there. I'll make it faster again by having repayment running more slowly. So there's the growth rate increasing again. It's running, it's actually running very, very slowly. But and debt to GDP ratio is going through the roof. It's still pretty low because it's running so slowly, only a 24-year mark here. I right-click, the current value is of 11%, but it's rising. If I now have a slowdown in the rate of lending, so rather than make repayment happen more rapidly first of all. So rather than 20 years to repay, let's say it goes down to 5. This is another bug. It's reset the whole bloody thing. I might just have to actually stop that, save, and I'll restart it again. These are various little bugs that we need funding to keep software being developed. Minsky beta. Okay, let's see if I can do it dynamically this time. So I'll start with 7 and 9, and now it should run more rapidly, which it is. Okay, so you can see the debt ratio rising there. It'll ultimately start to stabilise. Gross income's rising, money and the changing level of debt, changing the amount of money. We're now stabilising at about a 40% debt to GDP ratio there. If we have a faster rate of lending, then the debt ratio will rise, slow rate of repayment, faster rate of GDP growth. It's actually gone off the scale on the graph I've got down there. Now if you have a increase in the rate of repayment and a decline in the amount of lending, the rate of lending, you have a crisis. So there's a huge difference between loanable funds and endogenous money. And I might leave it at that point, and we might come back after another 5 or 10 minutes and go through the logic in the final part of a 3-hour lecture. Okay. Notice how I can't see how many this simulation's been running for 500 years. Okay. And notice GDP has bounced around. Okay. But no change in the overall level. And the bounces in GDP are precisely related to the velocity of circulation, which varies as money's shuffled between the various bank accounts because the different agents spend at different rates. So you change the aggregate velocity out. That velocity is calculated It's simply GDP divided by money. You know, how many times it turns over in a year. So that's calculated, but it's generated by the values that are given to all these various time constants here. And when you have lending that increases the amount of money in the account of the investment sector, then the investment sector consumes at a different rate to the consumer sector, and therefore you get a change in GDP. But if the money goes back again, the change is reversed. So there's really no impact on the level of debt goes through the roof. Nothing much happens to GDP. You can have falling debt and rising GDP, quite possibly, if the change in debt means the money goes to somebody with a lower propensity to spend, etc., etc. And the growth rate basically is zero. Okay. This is another little trick here done, by the way, too. Notice on the edge of each of the graphs there's a angled input. That's setting the maximum and minimum value for the axes. So you can use that to set, like I've got 10 as the maximum up here and minus 10 as the minimum down here. And I can vary those as I want during the simulation. I've got t, current time, as the input there, and t minus 20 over here. So it shows the last 20 years of data. The sliding window. Various little tricks like that to make it easy to see what's going on. Anyway, what's seen makes a big difference when you change across to endogenous money, where banks actually originate, and you see the dramatic changes in the level of debt, change the amount of money in existence, so there's a direct relationship between debt and money. Changes the growth rate, you get a positive growth rate most of the time, you can have booms and slumps in GDP, and there's no longer that tight link between velocity and the level of GDP, because velocity is not the only thing changing GDP. Okay? What's also changing GDP is lending. So lending is not just creating money, it's creating demand and income at the same time. This is the point I want to clarify, because it's still something that's being disputed in post-Keynesian economics. You look at in loanable funds, all you've got is banks intermediating between savers and lenders, no creation of money and no creation of additional demand apart from the change in demand by allocating money to somebody who spends it more rapidly than somebody else. That's the only way you can get a change in GDP in that model. With endogenous money, banks originate loans. I'm looking only at money being used productively here because it's mainly used for speculative reasons, which you need to really incorporate to have a proper general model. The lending creates money and it creates additional demand, so change in debt is adding to demand. Now, when I first started making this case, I would say that income is demand is income plus change in debt. And I went through all sorts of iterations. To me, if endogenous money didn't have effect on demand and income ultimately, then there's no point worrying about it. Okay? If I couldn't show that difference between the two situations, why bother? Even though it's institutionally correct to say banks lend money, if it made no difference in macroeconomics and it's, to keep it simple, principle, forget about it. Doesn't matter. It makes a huge difference, and that's why I've started with that particular simulation to show it to you. But it's getting logically reconciling it with expenditure is identically equal to income. So how do you reconcile the two? Well, I want to now show not the godly table idea anymore, but I want to now show what I'm calling an expenditure table. I'm going to have a three-sector model. I'm not worried about what they all stand for as S1, S2, S3. They could be consumption, investment, workers. It doesn't really matter. And I'm showing expenditure which is not financed by borrowing as in capital letters, and anything which is financed by borrowing in lowercase letters, just to indicate the logic. Look at three situations. One where you can't borrow at all. Okay, so simply you spend what you have, there's no borrowing possible. The others are loanable funds, you can borrow from other sectors, and the final one you borrow from the banks, endogenous money. Let's look at the logic of each of those. So the first one, I first called it Say's law, but Say's law says supply creates its own demand. In fact, this is the reverse. Demand creates its own supply. Okay? The money got to be spent before the supply is emanated. So you have three sectors. The sum of each vertical column is the net income for that sector. The horizontal shows the expenditure, both the source, the origin and the destination of spending. So each row has to sum to zero. That's the accounting identity again. So if you're spending A and B, it's minus A plus B on your amount of money, it's plus A and plus B on the sectors you're spending on. Each of the individual net incomes can be different to zero, but the sum is also zero. Okay? Which is why we talk about aggregate income rather than net income, because net income is zero. Okay? If this one sums to positive, these two sum to the exact equal negative. Okay? And that necessarily applies. So this is a logically tight way of thinking about expenditure and income, and therefore the diagonal axis defines aggregate demand. Okay? It's A plus B, C plus D, E plus F. The negative of that is aggregate demand, where the off-diagonal elements are aggregate income. Okay? And they're necessarily the same. So I can't make a logical mistake by working in this space. And I've been accused of plenty of logical mistakes in the last 10 years by post-Keynesians. Okay, so expenditure is obviously identical to income in that model. And what I'm doing now, I'm using a symbolic logic program to do the adding up. So you can see the bracketing there for the income the expenditure terms, and no bracketing for the income terms. Now, loanable funds, I'm going to have Sector 1 borrowing B from Sector 2 to spend on Sector 3, just to make it simple. It's obviously can be generalised from there. So Sector 2's funds fall by B, and Sector 1's spending increases by B. And I'm going to make this logically tighter in a moment as well. So that rather than Sector 2 sending D on Sector 3, it sends D minus B, and it hands the money over to Sector 1 that spends the money instead. Okay? So you sum up, and you get exactly the same situation, that the aggregate expenditure is equal to aggregate income, and the lending and saving cancel out. Okay? There's no aggregate role for lending and saving in that model. Now, what if you have the bank doing the lending? Well, in that case, the assets and the liabilities of the banking sector rise equally, and there's no offsetting fall in spending by Sector 2 or 3 because Sector 1 is borrowing from the banks. So I'm now got to include, and I didn't do this in one of my papers, and it led to some confusion, so I'm now doing it in the next version of that paper. I'm showing that the expenditure is financed by a loan from the banking sector, which means Sector 1 has B more to spend, which it spends on Sector 3. Okay? You do your adding up, and that change in debt now turns up as a part of aggregate demand and aggregate income. So expenditure is both finance. The way to look at that, you've clearly got more demand coming out of bank creation of money than if you don't have any bank at all. So there's an equivalent increase in expenditure and income. Now, if somebody borrows money and doesn't spend it, okay, you're going to get a difference. Okay? But people borrow to spend. People don't borrow to be in debt to a bank and watch their interest payments get more expensive. Plenty of people end up going bankrupt that way, but it's not why they do it in the first place. So to do this more precisely, I'm now going to show this using time constants. So what I've got is, if you think about borrowing money, if anybody here got a mortgage or ever had a mortgage? Okay, well, you know the story. You apply for a loan from the bank, they approve you saved like £500,000. That's sitting there as something you can access, but you don't actually have the debt to the bank until you actually buy the house. And then when you buy the house, that turns up as a debt actually you've got to pay interest on, and it's paid across as capital gains or partial capital gains to the person you buy the house from. Okay? So it's not manifest until you spend it, and that's the normal situation with most loans. So if you have a loan approval, they approve a certain amount of money you can spend buying somewhere, you don't actually have the debt to the bank until you actually exercise that option you have to go into debt to them, and then your debt is created in your account that you owe money to the bank, while the money is created in the account of the person you're buying the house off. So you get the loan and the expenditure and the income effectively simultaneously. I went through all sorts of attempts to get time differences to explain it. I got nowhere in trying to persuade other post-Keynesians. So I've basically said, let's forget about time sequences, milliseconds and stuff like that, and just go straight saying it all happens instantaneously. So I'm now going to look at this from the point of view of the bank first of all, and then do it with the time constants. If you see loanable funds from the bank's point of view, then the amount of money, and I'm using a different convention now, I'm not using a plus-minus convention of Minsky, I'm just showing money going down in an account, money going up somewhere as minus and plus. So if somebody's a saver who lends money, the amount of money they've got goes down, matched completely by what goes up in the borrower's account. There's no change to the assets of the banking sector, there's no change to its liabilities either. When the person spends, the money the borrower goes down, the money the recipient goes up, again no changes in assets and liabilities. What you have in the net sense is the savers' funds have gone down by this amount, the lenders have gone up by that much. Okay? No change from the bank's point of view. Of course, there's debt turning up as well, but that's off the bank's sheets. For endogenous money, you have the bank creates a loan. It's actually not lending. We should actually get a different word for it, because a bank doesn't lend. Lending implies giving something you've already got. No, it creates. Okay, so it's creating the money there. That means that turns up as money in the borrower's account, so both the assets and the liabilities of the bank have risen equally. Then when the person spends, this is separating it step by step, their money goes down, the recipient's money goes up. Again, there's no change in assets and liabilities. When you look at the net situation, there's an increase in loans, there's an increase in the amount of money in the recipient's account, so both the assets and liabilities have risen by the same amount. Okay? It's a fundamentally different situation to the one up here. Now, I want to do it more formally, because this is something I've actually clarified. I made one mistake in my previous paper, and that is that I left out the fact that when you think about loanable funds, what's going on is somebody, rather than having a flow of money going from their account to somebody else's account buying, part of the flow still goes there, but another part of the flow goes off to the person who's borrowing money from them. So the time constants for lending turn up in loanable funds. And that was something I've only found out in the last 3 or 4 weeks. The last 2 months. So I've got each sector having, sector X has a bank deposit which has SX dollars inside it. So I'm using SX as the symbol for the bank account, like I do in the Minsky tables. Spending at a rate of tau X of Y, so tau X of Y is the time constant for sector X buying from sector Y. And basically the same sort of situation. So now I'm showing the spending as being, there's the amount of money that sector 1 has, there's its spending on sector 2, and there's its spending on sector 3. So that goes across to sector 2, that goes across to sector 3. Overall, nothing is happening on bank equity side here because the banks aren't involved. So there's no lending at all in that particular situation. So you do your summation, you get the same basic idea. Aggregate expenditure is identical to aggregate income, and it's all the amounts of money in the accounts divided by the relevant time constants. Now, have loanable funds. What's happening there is somebody who would have a flow of expenditure going to one of the sectors still has partial part of that flow, and the actual amount of the flow might change because they've lent money, but part of the flow also goes to one of the other sectors. So the way I'll show that now is that here is expenditure by sector 1 on sector 2, no change there. But here's expenditure by sector 1 on sector 3, and it's borrowed money to spend on sector 3. And the amount of money it borrows flows out at the rate at which its time constant of expenditure is. Equally, the flow that sector 2 was going to spend on sector 3 is now fallen, so part of the flow is going across here to be spent by sector 1 on sector 3. Yeah.
What are the indices in the tau?
Okay, this tau 1, 2 is expenditure by sector 1 on sector 2.
It's always
From 2.
Okay.
From 2, yeah. Now, you sum this up. So that's part of what sector 1 was going to spend on, part of sector 2. Let's just edit that, fix that mistake up before I save this on my website. And that's lowercase. It's all the editing I do. Okay, so part of what sector 2 is going to spend on sector 3 is now lent to sector 1 instead. And of course, since there's an existing level of debt, because they've got a rate of change of debt as therefore an existing stock of debt, you've got to pay interest on that debt. And that's now, as well as paying money, being able to borrow money and pay more of it to sector 3, you've also got to pay interest on what you currently owe to sector 2. So that's correct again. So all the accounting is correct once more. And what you now find when you do the summation, you get a term involving change in debt in loanable funds. But it's multiplied by the difference between the inverses of the time constants. Okay? And of course, if they're the same, then that is 0. But if they're slightly different, you'll get a change in GDP, and that's why you get those variations I showed earlier in the Minsky simulation. So you now have interest on debt and a tiny proportion of the change in debt turning up as a source of both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income in loanable funds. So that's a new little discovery. And that's the logical basis for Bernanke's verbal statement. Again, if the neoclassicals were right about the institutional nature of lending, they'd be right about the role of debt in the economy as well. They're logically consistent. My point with a lot of my post-Keynesian colleagues is they've been logically inconsistent. They talk about the role of endogenous money, but they haven't been able to integrate it in terms of the role that has an aggregate demand and income. It can be integrated logically correctly. And that's what I'm doing in this lecture. So what do you have with banks originating loans now? Let's look at that. Well, now what I didn't show in my original paper in the review of post-Keynesian economics, the review of Keynesian economics, I implicitly left out the assets. Okay, now I'm including them to show that when you have this expression here in my table for endogenous money, that term here is because you've borrowed some rate of flow of debt from the banking sector. That's now become a rate of flow of your expenditure on sector 3. So there's a one-for-one relationship between the change in debt and the amount of expenditure you're doing, and equally the amount of income. You sum that across, there's the money, and I've got it in inverted commas deliberately because it's not really borrowed, it's created by lending, is spent by sector 1 on sector 2, which creates income for sector 2 at the same time as expenditure for sector 1. So when you sum that up, you get a one-for-one relationship between change in debt and aggregate demand and aggregate income. Now, to spell out in full detail, this is now sector 1's expenditure finance out of its existing money multiplied by the inverse of its time constants, plus the same for sector 2 and sector 3, plus the bank's expenditure, which I've got to include now because the bank is receiving interest income on this as well. And you get interest on debt turning up plus the change in debt. Okay? So it's logically complete to say that aggregate expenditure is identical to aggregate income and includes expenditure financed out of existing money plus gross financial transactions. If I included deposits, interest on deposits as well, that would turn up as a positive there, not a negative, plus change in debt. And that's your full statement of aggregate demand, aggregate income, and the role of change in debt. And that's what's being left out of neoclassical thinking and not yet properly integrated into post-Keynesian. So what you to think about, how do you logically express it? Because I used to say, expenditure is income plus change in debt, which implied, and in a sense, strictly speaking, it was, an expenditure income error. Okay? But in fact, what you have to say is expenditure is, in total, there's two sources of expenditure, or three really. Expenditure out of existing money, plus expenditure from gross financial transactions, plus expenditure from change in debt. Okay, so that's your overall logic. And you can actually add these, and I've been doing this for 10 years. And I'm now logically, the intuition was right. My way of expressing it first off was probably wrong, okay, but the intuition was correct, and that's one reason I would emphasise with you, go with your intuitions, okay. If you end up proving yourself wrong, you've got to reverse them. If you don't go with your intuitions, you can get a logical advance and not take it to the proper extent, which is what I think has happened with endogenous money in general. People have developed it as an argument but not shown why it matters. But the intuitions have been buried by the expenditure as identical to income logic. But looking at here, it's quite valid to add change in debt to GDP. Again, this is where thinking, get rid of period analysis out of your brains. If any of you think you can analyse economy, we're talking about this happens in this period, this happens in the next period. That's where a huge number of logical errors come from in post-Keynesian economics. There is no such thing as a period. Okay? It's an artificial construct that post-Keynesian economists have adopted as a kludgy, amateur way of doing dynamics. I'm being very heavy-handed here, deliberately. I think that's really caused a lot of the paralysis in the intellectual development of post-Keynesian economics. You want to mathematise it, work in continuous time. Now, the reason discrete time is, there's many reasons why discrete time is wrong for what we're talking about. But the fundamental reason is things don't happen discretely at the aggregate level in capitalism. Births happen discretely at the individual level in people. Okay? One woman will give birth to a child over a roughly 9-month period. If you want to simulate their family, you've got to have birth as a discrete event, Inception and inception plus 9 months. But when you have a population of people giving birth to children, you don't say population of England in 2016 is 1 plus the growth rate times the population in 2015. Okay? You say there's been when you aggregate all those individual events all occurring asynchronously, you get a continuous time function. And that's the same thing for economics. Investment does not occur at the same time for all firms. Consumption does not occur at the same time for all consumers. Investment and consumption have different time rates. Investment, the horizon might be 1 or 2 years. Consumption, it's a few weeks if you're poor. Okay? It's years if you're rich. So those time, in other words, the post-Keynesians have emphasised stock flow consistency, and they've got the financing right. They haven't got the time right. If you use continuous time, you do get the time right, and therefore you can get away from the intellectual problems that period analysis has caused. And that's one reason why I don't bother with structuralist versus, what's the other term, structuralist versus accommodationist or horizontalist. Yeah, it's a confusion of the way of representation. Okay, if you get the time dynamics right, the issue doesn't even arise in the first place. So working in continuous time, you can do this properly. If you think about GDP, what you have is a rate of production of output per unit of time. When we measure GDP now, let's say the GDP of England is currently measured as being £1 trillion per year. Okay, and we take again discrete time elements of that. It's all done in a very chunky way in the statistics. But fundamentally, that's a measure of the rate of flow of money in the economy at an instant in time. So if I say England's GDP is £1 trillion per year, what I'm effectively saying is if I take this measurement right now, then the rate of flow of money through the economy, if maintained for a year, would equal £1 trillion. Okay? But you can take it at an instantaneous point. So imagine you've got a river flowing. Okay, you take a measurement at a particular point, you will say this river is generating a flow of 300 megalitres per year. Okay? You're not saying 300 megalitres went past while you're measuring. That instantaneous rate over a year will give you 300 million. So you measure it at a particular point. Now imagine you've got a pump which can go either direction coming into that river. If you're measuring at the point where the pump is or slightly on the other side where the pump is, that's like new water being pumped in and new water being sucked out of the river. Now if you want to say what's the total flow of the river at that time, it's the sum of the flow coming through the river plus the in or out coming from the pump. And the same thing applies with debt. You can take GDP, measurement of GDP now as being a measure of the turnover of existing money. Add in the change in debt at that point, that's your total demand and income. Okay? So you can add income to the rate of change of new debt. And part of the hint that you can do this is dimensionality again, which is why I see it's very important to learn dimensional analysis, which engineers know very well. And that is your GDP is measured in dollars per year. Your expenditure in new debt is also measured in dollars per year. It's not as precise as what you could do measuring a river's flow in a pump, but you can add the two together and say that's the sum of income and expenditure at the same time. And you've got to include gross financial transactions as well, which is something I didn't realise until I did the analysis. So putting this in the terms economists often use, I'd say aggregate demand is the velocity of existing money multiplied by the amount of money there. That's fundamentally the GDP measure, plus the change in debt, plus interest on money, which is the deposit interest, plus interest on debt. Okay? It's all logically consistent and all derived from expenditure tables. So the income side you've also got to amend, of course, because we know, well, one thing, again, post-Keynesians have adopted from neoclassicals without being conscious of it in some ways, is when they say income is identical to expenditure, they're dividing finance off into a separate box as well, which is what the neoclassicals do. Now we know the vast majority of money created these days is created to finance asset speculation. So the income side has to include realised capital gains as well. So I'd see the actual equation being something like this. You've got GDP plus realised capital gains. And one way to represent realised capital gains, it's the change in the price level of assets times the quantity of assets times the turnover of assets per year. Those three factors together. And then that's going to be equal to turnover of existing money plus the new debt, most of which is financing this stuff these days, plus gross financial transactions. And that's your generalised statement of the relationship between income, expenditure and creation of new money. Now, what that means is that both GDP and capital gains are affected by the change in gap, a change in debt. And then if you take the differential, the relationship I've got there, as you can see, let's go one up again, is I've got GDP plus change in asset prices being related to velocity of money plus change in debt. If I take the differential of this to get the rate of change of GDP, I'm going to get partially also the acceleration of asset prices tied up, and the change in asset prices, and also asset prices themselves are all going to turn up with that chain rule there, related to the acceleration of debt. So you get a relationship between acceleration of debt and change in asset prices. It's complicated, it's messy, but it's real world. So take the differential there, and they're going to have GDP plus change in GDP plus a whole lot of terms coming out of this being equal to the differential here. And the main thing I want to focus upon is you're going to get a relationship between acceleration, the second differential of debt, and change in GDP, as well as change in asset prices. And that all turns up very strongly in empirical data. So also, when you look at macroeconomics in general, Keynes once made the case about making investment the predominant determinant of income because he said it was the most volatile. He called it causa causans. Okay? The predominant cause is going to be investment. So when you say the economy is investment driven, you're not saying consumption is unimportant. You're saying that consumption is less volatile than investment, and therefore more of the change is going to be related to change in investment. Same thing applies here. Velocity and the amount of money moves slowly. Change in debt can be very, very rapid. So fundamentally what you're going to find when you do regressions and all this stuff is the relationship of change in debt to the level of GDP and acceleration of debt to the change in GDP. That's going to be your dominant relationship. And that's what I've been finding again for the last 10 years. When I look at the correlations between change in debt and the level of economic activity, I find outrageously high correlations, which the mainstream ignores for logically sound and institutionally false reasons. Okay? The logic is sound. The loanable funds applied, you could ignore all this stuff. It'd only be trivial, second, third order stuff. But because loanable funds is wrong institutionally, endogenous money is correct, the change in debt plays an enormous role in setting the level of economic activity and the change in asset prices. So, and this all contradicts mainstream finance theory as well. So mainstream finance theory tells you no relationship between levels of leverage and levels of asset prices. Bullshit. Technically speaking, bullshit. Completely wrong. Do the empirical data, you find enormous correlations there. And in fact, they're the main determinant of both asset prices and what happens in the macroeconomy. So all this stuff is, once you integrate this stuff properly, you throw out conventional finance theory as well. And to give you just a few illustrations there before my voice dies, it's starting to die in a few minutes to chat it well. When you look at the level of debt, it isn't just that this is an important dynamic we've ignored in capitalism to date. We've also ended up with the biggest level of debt in human history. And I want to illustrate this with some sets of data. This is data taken from the American Federal Reserve and also the American Census Department. So the purple line here is the private debt to GDP ratio in America from 1952 on, as recorded in the flow of funds by the Federal Reserve. This one here is the Census Department's records, which you can find in a couple of long-term census data streams. There's a 1916 to 1950 record. Actually, it's 1970 here, I think. This record here is data the Census Bureau kept from 1916 to 1970. Now you can see that the ups and downs are very similar where these two correspond. So the R squared between the two series where they overlap is quite high. And they've been R squared between the change in the series as well. So clearly how the Federal Reserve defined debt gives you a lower level than the Census Department did. Okay? So to make them consistent, I've taken this data and I've tacked it on so it overlaps with the Federal Reserve data. So this says, rather than the way that the Census Department defined private debt, in the deflationary experience of the Great Depression, the level of private debt hit 240% of GDP, as the Census Department records it. Now, when you look at what the Federal Reserve would have recorded, they would have come at a level of about 150, 145%. I think actually probably the census figures are more accurate, okay? Because there's some elements when you look at how debt is defined in the flow of funds, it conflates bank and non-bank lending, for example, right down at the very bottom levels. You can't separate them out. They've literally lumped together bonds created by banks and bonds created by non-banks. in the one system, which means you just simply can't use the financial data that the Federal Reserve publishes as finding the financial sector's debt to the bank, the non-bank financial sector's debt to the financial sector. But
before?
pardon?
So before the slide, so you the brown and the green is an extrapolation of yours.
Yeah, this is other Federal Reserve. This is also census data on a fraction of bank loans. They had data going back to 1834, where they showed, rather than debt by the non-bank sector to the banks, they showed bank loans for a fraction of the American banks. That's the bottom thing down here. Now that also overlaps with the census data and overlaps with part of the Federal Reserve data. And again, the R-squareds between the changes are quite high. So I think you can also add them on. So this brown, green and purple line is my extrapolated version of the level of private debt in America, trying to make the data consistent going back to 1834. And even the Great Depression, with the huge deflationary experience there, gave us a lower level of debt than we have today. Okay? I think, in fact, the proper record of debt might have us up here somewhere, okay, if you're using the census figures data, which was just two different ways of finding the data. But that's the Federal Reserve. So I think on this basis, we have a higher level of debt now than America's had in its history as a nation, and in fact it's trying to rise from a level that already exceeds the peak it reached in the Great Depression, which is why I don't think there's much headroom for increased credit growth in future. Of course, from a loanable funds point of view, no problem. Get out there and lend, guys. You know, we need more borrowing, we need more investment, etc., not a problem. Because if there's lending between one non-bank agent and another non-bank agent, then there's no increase in money, there's the change in debt, redistribute spending power, no macroeconomic impact. At least we're going to have more activities. That's why they're arguing in favour of trying to get banks to lend more money. They can't. They're not going to succeed with that level of debt in the real world of endogenous money. Yeah.
How do we control this money for increased future income?
In what? In
the income level of the general population. Clearly the amount of debt a household might have, however we aggregate including our measure. The reason they got that, the reason the deposit was written for them, is because they presented a statement of income prospects. And that new deposit essentially is underwritten by the bank's assessment for those future income prospects. So it's not so much the total level we're interested in, vis-a-vis what happened in the past, but the total level with regard to future projected income stream of that house.
It's also the total level. The total level also matters in a crucial way.
If our incomes are getting larger and larger and larger, then our
only
level as well can get larger and larger and larger. It doesn't necessarily signify we're going to have a terrible crash.
It does. I'll have to explain that to you in next week's lecture.
It's 10% of GDP, so that's already adjusted for income.
Yeah.
Well, it's future income. It's not. It's
well,
what people believe the future income is going to be, because when I get my loan, my mortgage or my loan I'm getting from a commercial bank, then they're looking at my future income prospects.
And they're getting it wrong.
Well, that's their job as the exports and capitalism.
Yeah. But what they're getting wrong is they don't see the relationship between change in debt and income to begin with. Now, part of that change in debt is the source of the income. That's what I'm arguing beforehand. There's a feedback they're ignoring. Okay, because in their model, loanable funds model, there's no big relationship between change in debt and income. Okay, it's just the difference in marginal propensities.
There were goods and services moving.
Huh?
There are goods and services being exchanged.
Oh yeah, but
the economy is producing.
Yeah, but you can't go to your bank and pay your debt back with car tyres. Okay, you've got to have money for it. So we're talking about this. This is again why having a real analysis leaving out the monetary sector is such a mistake. Because they assume as if, you're producing more goods and services, can't you use that? No, if you produce more goods and services without an increase in the amount of money that you generate out of that, you can't pay your debt to the bank by your increased output of widgets. You've got to sell the widgets and get money for them. If the money's not rising rapidly, you won't be able to service that debt. So it still comes down to the role of money in the system. And when you get this level of credit, what I'll talk about in more detail in the next few lectures is income, because income and expenditure are that generated of existing money plus that generated by new credit. Okay. Then over the history that we've been through, a period of a large part of the demand and income across that period was generated by rising credit. You get on the other side of this and you're already at a level where you're not going to rise anymore, the credit-based demand is going to be less than it was in this whole period. So your economy is still doing the same physical things to some extent. You've still got innovation going on, but less because less is getting financed. You have a low rate of population growth as well in some countries, etc., etc. But you will not get, if those growth trends, if the population and technology trends continue, you wouldn't get the income growth at the same time coming out of it because there's no longer going to be credit growth. Yeah.
I want to pick, which is the qualitative change in financialization, because they can disrupt, if there's like something new, they can, I don't know, from the 70s to now, because they can disrupt you will see like the debt is always what's the difference, the big difference, or what's that?
What it then means is that change in debt is far more dramatic up here than it is down here. Okay? And I'll illustrate that with a few examples next week. If you have a small level of debt to GDP, and there's a large change in the rate of growth of debt, it has a small impact upon aggregate demand and income. If you're up here and you've got a large level of debt, and there's a change in the rate of change of debt has got a dramatically bigger effect here than down here. And I'll empirically verify that for you next week, in the next few weeks' lectures.
During the post-war period, they say like there was like a repression of finance. There wasn't like too much debt crisis in that period, but we've seen.
And
what I want to understand is like the general trend of like global capitalism, how financialization have changed all these trends.
Well, I think I'm pretty much relating it to the level of debt compared to GDP, and saying back here we had a non-financialised economy because, in fact, on a historical basis, we began the Second World War with one of the lowest levels of debt in America's history. So it was not financial. We had sufficient finance for what we needed to do, and credit could grow rapidly. Okay. Now we have far too much debt, so credit can't go rapidly, if at all. And therefore, the level of debt itself is a problem. That's the main reason why the capitalist economy is not growing right now. Not secular stagnation, but financial stagnation from too much private debt. I want to just give you an idea. This is something I've just, this is looking at that same data. This is now looking, the red line is the aggregate level using that combined data system I put together. The blue line is the change in debt measured on the right-hand side. And I think you can see a trend there. The bigger the level of debt, when there's a change in debt, the more dramatic the change in debt is as a percentage of GDP, simply because your level of debt is larger compared to GDP. So back down here, the ups and downs in the 50s were relatively small. The big volatility began about the 70s to 80s. And then we had the biggest volatility event of all to give us the financial crisis.
Because if you theoretically do not postulate the connection between credit and income, then you cannot understand leveraging at all.
That's right.
Because
Once you understand the role of credit in income and expenditure, then you can understand deleveraging. Okay? Which is why I've been doing this for so many years.
And so you were saying that the change basically in private debt affects the level. But
of demand and income.
It's actually just a reaction to the deleveraging.
What's that? No, the deleveraging is actually just taking money out of the economy and reducing spending as well.
Yeah, which is the obvious reaction of a firm who is in
Yeah,
debt.
that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me, in the 19th century, I would imagine that a fairly small percentage of the population were actually able to borrow. Only the rich.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's demographic things happening as well. I mean, kind of, and obviously you wouldn't go break down the data over that period, but I'd be interested in who it is that's borrowing and
well, for example, back in the Great Depression, and it happens in China now as well, most of the borrowing here is by the corporate sector, not by the household sector. So you can get private debt broken down to household and business back in the 1920s and 30s, and you find that I think roughly the level of household debt was about 1 quarter, pardon me, what the corporate debt is, whereas now household debt's larger than corporate debt. So there is a big change, but in fact,
what I'm saying is that could be a demographic.
It's
not.
It's more the change in the bank's behaviour these days. Yeah.
The bank's behaviour is organically linked to the demographics because take a house.
Yeah.
In the 50s, there's one male earner who's probably going to retire at 60 and probably will die at 70. By the time we get to today, we've got two earners.
Yeah.
They're both probably going to go to 90 and probably both not going to retire at 70.
Yeah.
So the amount of debt the bank is going to write for them, predicated against that far longer and doubled income stream, means that we're going to get a bigger deposit today.
Yeah, but we also have the dilemma that all that income increase by women entering the workforce has largely gone into asset price inflation in the finance sector.
So the second question then is it possible, is this a ratchet one way, or is it possible, theoretically at least, for policies of equality to redistribute wealth to wages in such a way that we could replace the debt component of demand with wage-led demand?
I think it is.
For example.
Pardon?
For me, like what you said, like this demographic argument, there were some studies done in Austria, for example, where they calculate how the demographic change would be compensated if full employment were objective for the economy and not only high employment. Yeah. And they found that if there was full employment, that this effect of this demographic change, that people work longer and live longer, actually wouldn't matter too much.
Yeah.
If employment would increase because more people would pay into the pension system.
I'll show you in the next couple of weeks that the actual, even if I model just the corporate sector borrowing, it's the workers who pay the extra cost. Okay, so the complex system effect there. I'll finish with one last slide. We've got to think about the class coming in a moment here. This is now I've just done this recently. This is looking at level of private debt to GDP across developed nations, the aggregate global economy, and then developing nations. And you can see that this is I think about 20 developed countries. Rising level of private debt, hit the peak in 2010, been heading down ever since. Third world on the other side, and developing world, and of course this is mainly China turning up here. No particular pattern after the 90s. There's the 97 crisis and then down again. Look where they've got to this time. And of course China is far beyond this ratio. That's the aggregate global ratio. So I think we really are at the time of peak debt.
That doesn't include the crash in 2015, because about a quarter of global equity lost gone.
Well, that's only equity.
Margin,
yeah, I haven't looked at the level of income and debt yet, though. Yeah.
Developing markets, though, have got reason to think that their income is going to grow much faster than developed markets. Right?
Like China?
So, yeah.
Not anymore. They've got far too high level of debt.
Over a period of time.
Yeah, but the thing is, the danger level that my colleague Richard Vague identified is debt level of 1.5 times GDP. And I'll show you why that matters in the next few weeks' time.
But the amount of debt you have, it matters how fast you think you're in.
Yeah, but the thing is, this rate of acceleration of debt means that a huge part of the demand that's driven the global economy in the last 4 years has been due to increased leverage in the credit growth in the third world. Now, when that credit growth stops, that's going to be an additional reason for a downturn in the global economy, which is happening now. Okay? So we've got to leave it at that because we've got another class turning up here. I'll get out of the way again.